My spouse, the CEO, a woman of considerable means, evicted me after succumbing to her siblings' fabrications. 3 weeks later, she inquired if I had undergone any introspection. I presented her with divorce documentation. Her sister erupted in outrage. "You know the saying about hindsight being crystal clear? Let me enlighten you. At times you can foresee disaster looming from a considerable distance, yet your own obstinacy prevents you from vacating the perilous path. Such has been the general trajectory of my existence, or at least the 44 years culminating in this extraordinary predicament I am about to unravel for you. My appellation is Marcus Hale, and until approximately 3 months prior, I believed I was experiencing the epitome of the American dream. Envision this: a man of passable appearance, possessing a stable profession in project management, wed to one of the city's most influential figures, Clara Whitmore. Indeed, that Whitmore, whose visage adorns the cover of Forbes with remarkable regularity, was my wife, the chief executive of Whitmore Luxury Real Estate, an enterprise that effectively commands a significant portion of the choicest properties from Manhattan to the Hamptons. Upon hearing of my marital union with Clara Whitmore, individuals' jaws would descend with such force that the impact could be perceived from several blocks away. On paper, our union was unequivocally flawless. She provided the substantial financial resources, the crucial connections, and an influence that secured preferential seating at establishments lacking even nominal signage. I, in turn, offered stability, dependability, and what she habitually referred to as that endearing everyman quality that kept me anchored. In essence, I was the conventional individual who afforded her the sensation of not being entirely ensconced in an ivory tower constructed from a $100 denomination. Our wedding photographs resembled a spread from an architectural publication. Her opulent apartment, offering panoramic views of Central Park through expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, created the illusion of levitating above the common populace. The marble island in the kitchen alone commanded a price exceeding that of most individuals' automobiles. And let us not even broach the subject of the wine cellar, which housed vintages whose value surpassed my entire collegiate education. Clara would often jest that marrying me was the most prudent investment she had ever undertaken. I would readily concur, interpreting her remark in the tender, affectionate manner couples express their mutual betterment. A prelude to what is to come. She did not intend it so. However, herein lies the point where our idyllic narrative veers sharply into a disquieting reality. Clara possessed a younger sister, Sabrina Whitmore. If Clara represented the favored child incapable of error, then Sabrina embodied the family's perennial letdown, adorned in designer attire and exuding an attitude potent enough to sour milk. Sabrina, at the age of 28, remained voluntarily unengaged in employment, having perfected the art of subsisting on her sister's munificence as if it were a competitive sport. She had meticulously orchestrated her lifestyle. Clara financed her Manhattan residence, her credit card expenditures, her fitness club membership, her therapeutic sessions, her organic detoxifying beverages, and likely her monthly manicures, which incurred costs greater than some individuals allocate to their weekly provisions. Sabrina preferred to term this familial support, but the remainder of us recognized it for what it was: effortless living, bolstered by a trust fund. From our initial encounters, Sabrina regarded me with an expression akin to encountering something disagreeable on her morning promenade through Central Park. Not that she actually engaged in jogging, Strenuous physical activity was beneath her refined sensibilities. But you grasp the implication. At every family gathering, every celebratory occasion, every spontaneous visit, she would bestow upon me that particular gaze. You are familiar with it, the one that suggests she is mentally calculating the precise monetary drain I would represent to them over the ensuing years. Sabrina's peculiar talent lay in framing her malevolent observations as solicitousness. Clara, my dear, do you not perceive Marcus as somewhat too accustomed to your affluent lifestyle? She would inquire, her tone suffused with feigned concern. I mean, it is remarkably charming how swiftly he has adapted to luxury, almost as if he were predestined for it. Wouldn't you agree? And Clara, bless her brilliant yet guileless disposition, would nod in agreement, as if Sabrina were imparting profound wisdom rather than launching insidious barbs calculated to dismantle my marriage from within. The dinner table dialogues devolved into my personal torment. Picture this tableau: Clara presiding at the head of the table, deliberating on her latest multi-million-dollar transaction, while serenely sipping wine that cost more per bottle than many earn in a week. I, endeavoring to contribute something of substance to the discussion, concurrently contemplating whether my middle-class origins were conspicuously displayed on my countenance like a scarlet insignia, and Sabrina, positioned there with that knowing smirk. Oh, that infernal smirk, as if she held a secret unknown to the rest of us. Marcus, do illuminate us on your day, Sabrina would interject with feigned sweetness, and somehow she would contrive to make it sound as though I were tasked with explaining quantum physics to a toddler. Did you happen to oversee any intriguing projects today? Nothing excessively taxing, I trust. We would not wish for you to become unduly fatigued. The underlying sentiment was invariably present, as palpable as thick syrup. You do not belong here. You are insufficient for my sister. You are merely another opportunist with superior social graces. And incrementally, agonizingly, I began to observe a transformation in Clara. The woman who once regarded me as the center of her universe began scrutinizing my features as though attempting to decipher a complex enigma. Her laughter became more perfunctory than genuine. Her inquiries regarding my professional activities evolved from expressions of interest to something resembling an interrogation. How was your day, my love? Transmuted into, so precisely what were your tangible achievements today? The transition was subtle initially, akin to observing paint drying or vegetation growth, yet it was undeniable. Each discourse felt akin to undergoing cross-examination by a prosecuting attorney who had already predetermined my culpability. Sabrina was an expert strategist, the sort of individual who could plant seeds of doubt with such adroitness that one would invariably believe they had germinated naturally. She never directly leveled accusations. That would have been too transparent. Instead, she would interject subtle remarks, minuscule suggestions that infiltrated Clara's consciousness like insidious subterranean termites. I confess to experiencing occasional apprehension for you, Clara, she would confide during their sisterly bonding interludes, to which I was not privy. You are remarkably trusting, exceedingly generous. Some individuals might potentially exploit that precious heart of yours. And Clara, capable of identifying a disadvantageous business proposition from a considerable distance, adept at negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts in her sleep, somehow failed to perceive that her own sibling was manipulating her with remarkable skill. The most distressing aspect was my acute awareness of its unfolding. Every single day I witnessed the erosion of my marriage, one whispered exchange at a time. One arched brow, one perfectly timed exhalation from Sabrina. It was akin to observing a vehicular collision in slow motion, with me as the passenger while another person steered directly toward the protective barrier. I attempted to broach the subject with Clara once. A monumental error, indeed. She regarded me as though I had just proposed that her sister was operating an illicit substance manufacturing facility from her Park Avenue domicile. Sabrina adores me, Marcus. She is merely looking out for my well-being. Perhaps if you made a greater effort to comprehend her perspective, rather than perpetually adopting a defensive posture. It was at that juncture I comprehended the futility of my struggle. Within Clara's perception, I was the outsider, the variable that did not harmonize with the equation of her seemingly perfect existence. Sabrina had an established history, 28 years of shared experiences and inside jokes. My tenure consisted of 3 years of marriage and a burgeoning reputation as the apprehensive husband incapable of enduring his sister-in-law's candid solicitations. However, here is a crucial detail that eluded both of them. While I may have embodied the steady, dependable, ordinary husband, I was far from unintelligent, and I certainly had no intention of capitulating without a struggle. They presumed to have me thoroughly analyzed. They conjectured that I would simply acquiesce and accept whatever destiny they decreed for me. Oh, how mistaken they were. If I considered the initial chapter challenging, allow me to recount the masterclass in psychological manipulation that Sabrina orchestrated over the subsequent months. This individual did not merely thrive on discord, she possessed an advanced degree in it. I speak of someone who could instigate conflict in an empty chamber and somehow assign blame to everyone else present. Have you ever encountered an individual who treats deception as an art form? Such was Sabrina Whitmore in essence. She did not merely fabricate untruths. She meticulously constructed them, polished them to a gleam, and presented them with such unwavering conviction that you would begin to doubt your own recollections. It was, frankly, awe-inspiring in its most terrifying manifestation. The allegations of infidelity commenced on a Tuesday. I recall it vividly as I was scheduled to join Clara for luncheon at that exorbitantly priced bistro she frequented downtown. The establishment where a salad commands $30 and is presented as an artisanal creation. I was delayed due to a client consultation when my mobile device vibrated with an incoming communication from Clara. Rain check on lunch. I need to process some matters Sabrina shared. A few words, yet they carry the ominous weight of a hazardous materials warning as they were poised to contaminate the entirety of our shared foundation. Upon my arrival home that evening, the ambient temperature within our penthouse seemed to have plummeted by 20 degrees. Clara was seated in her preferred fauteuil, that imposing white leather piece whose cost eclipsed the monthly rent of most individuals. Her expression conveyed the appearance of someone who had just discovered I was orchestrating a clandestine human trafficking operation from our guest chamber. "We need to converse," she stated, "and believe me, if you have ever experienced marital commitment, you are aware that these 4 words constitute the relationship equivalent of a code red alert. All personnel to their stations, prepare for impact." "Of course, my dear. What is the matter?" I inquired, attempting to maintain a light-hearted demeanor while my stomach performed contortions that would impress an Olympic gymnast. Clara inhaled deeply, the sort of respiration one takes before leaping from a precipice or delivering somber news about a beloved pet. "Sabrina observed you dining with a woman today, a blonde individual at Cafe Milano." Now, herein lies the sheer absurdity of the situation. Firstly, I was not at Cafe Milano. I was ensconced in a conference room with three gentlemen of middle age, engaged in a discussion concerning the logistical timetables for a construction endeavor. Secondly, the sole blonde individual with whom I had interacted throughout the day was the barista at Starbucks, who, despite my patient enumeration of its letters, misspelled my name, Marcus. Yet Sabrina had sown this seed of suspicion, and Clara was already nurturing it as if it were destined to blossom into a magnificent garden of justified distrust. Clara, my darling, I was occupied with meetings the entire day. I can provide access to my schedule, my electronic correspondence. Indeed, I can likely procure surveillance footage from my office edifice if you so desire. But here is the fundamental characteristic of Sabrina's deceptions. They were never solely concerned with factual accuracy. Their purpose was to cultivate an atmosphere, to paint a vivid picture, to construct a narrative wherein I was cast as the antagonist and she as the solicitous sister, endeavoring to shield Clara from heartbreak. "It is not merely today, Marcus," Clara asserted, and I could practically discern Sabrina's voice emanating from her. "She has been making observations. The manner in which you have been dressing more impeccably of late, your increased punctuality at work, the fact that you have been paying more attention to your personal grooming." I stared at her as though she had just declared the earth to be flat and that avian creatures were covert governmental surveillance devices. "You imply that I have been dressing more elegantly because you procured superior attire for me, and remaining at work later because we secured 3 significant new clients, and attending to my appearance because I am married to one of the city's most accomplished women, and I do not wish to cause you embarrassment at professional functions." But logic holds no sway when an individual has already reached a verdict of guilt. Clara possessed that distinctive look in her eyes, the same one she adopted when finalizing a particularly challenging real estate transaction. Her decision was made, and she was now merely seeking validation for her conclusion. The accusations regarding financial impropriety followed, for apparently I was simultaneously expected to be a faithless spouse and a financial leech. According to Sabrina's most recent intelligence, I had been diverting funds into ancillary ventures and leveraging Clara's connections for personal enrichment. This was rather rich considering the individual whose sole occupation was the professional liquidation of her sister's assets. But alas, who is keeping precise records? She presented me with bank statements, Marcus, transfers of funds into accounts unknown to me. This is the juncture where I nearly succumbed to mirth, for these enigmatic transfers represented my allocation of funds into a savings account intended as a surprise for Clara's anniversary trip to Italy. The unknown accounts were explicitly labeled Anniversary Fund Italy Trip within my banking application. However, Sabrina had strategically captured screenshots at precisely the opportune angle to lend an air of suspicion, as if she were a forensic financial investigator who had failed to complete detective school. "Clara, those are savings for your anniversary present. I can log into my account this very instant and demonstrate," or she interrupted, and I could practically envision Sabrina whispering in her ear, "You could have fabricated that as a pretext in the event I discovered it." It was at this moment I realized I was confronting a level of paranoia typically associated with conspiracy theories. Regardless of the evidence I presented, there was invariably an alternative explanation that portrayed me in an unfavorable light. It was akin to engaging in a game of chess with an opponent who unilaterally altered the rules whenever they were on the verge of defeat. The most agonizing aspect was not the accusations themselves, but rather witnessing Clara's metamorphosis into someone utterly unfamiliar. This woman, who had once placed unwavering trust in me, who would fiercely defend me against any adversary, was now treating every utterance emanating from my lips as though it required verification by 3 independent sources. My acquaintances attempted to provide counsel. Dave from work took me out for libations and remarked, "Man, your sister-in-law is unequivocally toxic. Clara is allowing her to exert control as if she were a marionette." My companion Mike was more direct. "My friend, you must proactively address this situation before it escalates. That Sabrina character has a vendetta against you, and she will not cease until she achieves her objective." But I remained steadfast. I believed that affection would ultimately triumph over manipulation. I presumed that 3 years of matrimony would carry greater weight than a lifetime of sibling ties forged through financial dependency and emotional coercion. I harbored the conviction that Clara would eventually penetrate Sabrina's stratagems and recognize the unfolding reality. I was profoundly, catastrophically, and spectacularly mistaken. The pivotal confrontation that irrevocably altered our circumstances transpired on a Thursday evening. I recall it because we were scheduled to view the concluding episode of a particular series Clara favored, the one chronicling the lives of affluent individuals grappling with the complexities of wealth, which paradoxically rendered our own affluence-related challenges seemingly trivial by comparison. Instead, Clara awaited my arrival in the drawing room, armed with what appeared to be a comprehensive presentation. I refer to printed electronic correspondence, highlighted financial statements, and a chronological account of my alleged indiscretions that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. Sabrina's influence was palpable throughout, yet Clara presented it as though she had independently unearthed all the evidence. "I can no longer continue this, Marcus," she declared, her voice emanating a chill surpassing that of a Manhattan winter. "Sabrina would not deceive me regarding a matter of such gravity. She cherishes me. She is safeguarding my interests, and everything she has conveyed to me aligns perfectly." It was at that precise moment I understood defeat was inevitable, not as a consequence of any actions on my part, but because Sabrina had executed her long-term strategy flawlessly. She had persuaded Clara that affection necessitates suspicion, that trust is indicative of naivete, and that the sibling who had been steadily depleting her finances was a more reliable confidant than the husband with whom she had been constructing a shared future. Reflecting on it now, I should have anticipated this outcome. However, sometimes, when one is engulfed by the tempest, the formation of the hurricane around them remains imperceptible. The domicile that once felt like sanctuary had unequivocally transformed into hostile territory. You are familiar with that cinematic trope, where the protagonist experiences a sudden, unexpected setback, invariably accompanied by a dramatic orchestral crescendo as they stand bewildered and betrayed. Well, real life does not afford a soundtrack, and let me assure you, being summarily expelled from one's own residence is considerably less cinematic and far more soul-crushingly ignominious than Hollywood would have you believe. It occurred on a Friday evening in October. I recall it because the foliage in Central Park was just beginning its autumnal transformation, and I had been contemplating how Clara and I used to stroll through its expanse during our inaugural autumn together. It is remarkable how the human mind fixates on the most trivial details when one's world is on the precipice of collapse. I had merely returned from my professional duties, loosening my cravat and anticipating a tranquil weekend. Perhaps ordering from that Thai establishment Clara favored, engaging in some passive viewing on Netflix. You understand, the typical activities of a married couple. Instead, I entered what felt like a high-stakes corporate boardroom negotiation, where I occupied the dual roles of the defendant and the individual who had evidently missed the briefing regarding the accusations leveled against me. Clara stood in our sitting room. Her sitting room, as I was soon to be reminded, adorned in that characteristic navy blue power suit that conveyed an air of serious business. Not the pleasant kind of business either. The sort that culminates in termination, dissolution of marriage, or in my case, both concurrently. Her arms were clasped, her countenance was more frigid than the posterior of a penguin in Antarctica, and positioned behind her like some sort of couture-clad specter, whispering insidious counsel into her ear, stood Sabrina, a smirk gracing her lips with an intensity that could have powered a significant portion of Manhattan. "We need to converse," Clara stated, a phrase that had become her recent linguistic trademark. It was as though she had secured exclusive rights to those 4 words and elected to wield them as instruments of mass psychological devastation against my inner peace. "Very well," I responded, placing my attaché case down and attempting to ascertain the prevailing mood. The atmosphere was somewhere between that of a funeral parlor and an execution chamber, which should have served as my initial premonition that this was unlikely to be a discourse concerning weekend excursions or the equitable division of dry cleaning responsibilities. Clara inhaled deeply, the sort of breath one takes prior to undertaking a surgical procedure or initiating a demolition project. "Pack your belongings, Marcus. I can no longer place my trust in you." Just like that. No prelude, no elaborate explanation, no dramatic preamble, merely a declaration that struck me with the force of a freight train, carrying a substantial consignment of sheer bewilderment. I remained motionless for a moment, anticipating a comedic reveal or the presence of a hidden camera crew, or indeed anything that might lend coherence to the situation. "I beg your pardon," I managed to articulate, as my cognitive faculties had apparently opted for a brief sabbatical precisely when they were most essential. "You heard me," Clara asserted, her voice adopting that flat, authoritative tone she employed when terminating underperforming employees. "I require you to vacate this residence this very evening. I cannot coexist under the same roof with someone in whom I have lost confidence." Under her roof, not our shared roof, her roof, because evidently 3 years of marital union had merely constituted my occupying Clara's premises as an unwelcome guest who had ultimately exhausted his hospitality. Behind her, Sabrina was practically quivering with a palpable sense of triumph. She no longer bothered to conceal her elation. The pretense had been abandoned, the defenses lowered, and she was basking in her victory as if she were a feline that had just captured the most substantial and dim-witted rodent in the annals of pest control. "Clara, my dear, let us discuss this rationally," I implored, striving to maintain a calm and reasoned tone, as if I were negotiating a business contract rather than fighting for the preservation of my marriage. "Whatever Sabrina has communicated to you, I implore you to disregard it." Clara raised her hand in a gesture reminiscent of a traffic controller halting an errant vehicle. "Do not dare attempt to shift the onus onto my sister. Sabrina did not compel you to deceive me. Sabrina did not compel you to engage in clandestine activities behind my back. Sabrina did not compel you to exploit me for my financial resources and connections. It was akin to listening to a compilation of all the detrimental notions Sabrina had been instilling in her for an extended period. Suggestions that insidiously poisoned our bond, delivered with the unwavering conviction of someone who had completely embraced the deception. None of that is factual, Clara, and you are aware of it, I contended, and despite my most earnest efforts to remain composed, I could detect a note of desperation creeping into my voice. I have never uttered an untruth to you. I have never betrayed your fidelity, and I can assure you, I have never exploited you for any personal gain. I love you. Sabrina actually snorted at that, a sound akin to a choked gasp, as if I had just delivered the worst possible punchline at the most inopportune moment. Oh, please, Marcus, she retorted, save the dramatic theatrics for an audience willing to purchase a ticket. I'm not speaking to you, I declared, turning to face her directly, a gaze I hadn't afforded her since this entire dreadful ordeal began. In fact, I'm quite certain none of this concerns you in the slightest. It became my concern the moment you began inflicting pain upon my sister, Sabrina shot back, her voice laced with a performative display of righteous fury. Clara deserves far better than someone who perpetuates falsehoods to her face on a daily basis. That was the exact instant Clara intervened. The subtle shift in her stance, positioning herself slightly in front of Sabrina, as if shielding her from me, communicated volumes about her unwavering allegiance. Sabrina wouldn't deceive me about something of this gravity, Marcus. She adores me. She's vigilant on my behalf. And quite frankly, she's been entirely correct about you from the outset. Correct about me from the start. The implication was clear. Sabrina had been orchestrating my downfall from the very beginning. And Clara was only now articulating it aloud. It meant my wife had been passively absorbing her sister's venomous influence on our union for 3 years. And instead of safeguarding our partnership, she had been meticulously documenting every perceived transgression. So that's it then, I inquired, feeling a distinct solidification within my chest, as if my heart were undergoing a palpable transformation into stone. 3 years of matrimony, and you're prepared to discard it all because your jobless, parasitic sister has convinced you I'm some sort of criminal mastermind. The jab about being unemployed and a freeloader struck a nerve. A flush of crimson spread across Sabrina's visage, and for a fleeting moment, I perceived a hairline fracture in her otherwise impenetrable smugness. But Clara advanced further, her ingrained instincts as a chief executive officer kicking in to safeguard her investment. Depart, Marcus, immediately before I summon security. Security. She was threatening to summon security against her own husband, within the confines of the residence we had shared for 3 years, the very home where we had shared laughter, navigated disagreements, experienced intimacy, and forged aspirations for our future, where we had marked anniversaries, birthdays, and holidays. She intended to have me escorted out as if I were an unwelcome intruder who had overstayed his welcome at a casual gathering. I surveyed the living area one final time, my gaze lingering on the sofa where we once shared cinematic evenings, the dining table where we had entertained guests, the windows offering a panoramic view of the cityscape we had envisioned growing old in together. Everything now felt alien, as if I were observing a stranger's existence through the sterile barrier of a museum exhibit. Very well, I conceded. my voice sounding oddly distant even to myself. "I shall gather a few belongings." As I made my way toward the bedroom, specifically to retrieve some clothing and necessities, I overheard Sabrina whispering something to Clara, undoubtedly solidifying her triumph with some final insidious observation about how this vindicated her foresight. I tossed a few shirts, trousers, undergarments, and toiletries into a single duffel bag, operating on sheer autopilot as my mind struggled to comprehend the enormity of what had transpired. 3 years of my existence reduced to the contents of one bag, packed within a 10-minute window, while my wife's sister observed from the doorway like a prison guard, ensuring I didn't pilfer any valuables. Upon my return to the living room, Clara stood by the entrance, holding it ajar, as if eager for my departure. Sabrina was practically vibrating with anticipation. "This is a grave error, Clara," I stated one last time, "and one day you will undoubtedly recognize that fact." "The only mistake I made was ever placing my trust in you," she retorted, her gaze averted. And so I departed. I exited the penthouse, the building, the very life I had constructed with an individual I believed loved me enough to extend me the basic courtesy of the doubt. The door closed behind me with a resounding thud that echoed the finality of a coffin lid being sealed. Standing on the sidewalk, my sole bag in hand, observing the ceaseless flow of taxis and pedestrians engaged in their typical Friday evening routines, I experienced an unexpected sensation. Relief. Beneath the layers of hurt, anger, and betrayal, a peculiar sense of liberation emerged. It was as if I had finally ceased feigning normalcy in a situation that was demonstrably dysfunctional. They believed they had prevails. They assumed I would return, groveling for absolution and pledging to mend my ways. They were utterly oblivious to the forces they had just unleashed. Have you ever frequented those upscale wellness centers that offer a sensory deprivation tank, touting its supposed therapeutic benefits? Well, allow me to illuminate your understanding of the 3 weeks I spent sequestered in my rather dingy downtown apartment. It amounted to essentially the same experience, except instead of discovering inner tranquility, I was meticulously devising the most exquisitely crafted retribution in the annals of marital conflict. My new abode, as described by real estate professionals, could be termed cozy. To the average person, it was simply a shoebox with an inflated sense of its own importance. 600 square feet of unadulterated mediocrity, complete with a refrigerator that emitted noises akin to a dying sea creature, and neighbors who evidently considered the practice of interpretive dance at 2 a.m. a perfectly reasonable life choice. After 3 years of residing in Clara's opulent penthouse, this dwelling felt like a demotion from first class to the cargo hold of existence. But you know what? It was unequivocally mine. No one possessed the authority to dislodge me from it. No one could stand in the living area and demand I pack my belongings, citing a loss of trust. And most crucially, no one could permeate the atmosphere with insidious whispers about my character flaws while I was attempting to unwind with Netflix and a bowl of cereal for dinner, a semblance of functional adulthood. The initial few days were, I concede, quite challenging. I spent considerable time gazing at the ceiling, pondering the inexplicable trajectory that had led my life down such a sharp and bewildering detour into the realm of madness. I would awaken each morning reaching for Clara, only to be reminded that Clara was likely indulging in a champagne breakfast with her deranged sister, celebrating their victory over the nefarious husband who apparently had been perpetrating an elaborate marriage scam for the past 3 years. Yet here's the crucial insight regarding hitting rock bottom. It actually provides a remarkably solid foundation upon which to build. And while I was occupying my apartment, consuming takeout Chinese cuisine, and contemplating whether this represented the onset of a midlife crisis, something rather curious began to unfold. My telephone remained silent. Not a single notification. Absolutely no calls from Clara inquiring about my well-being, my current state, or suggesting a mature discussion about our predicament, rather than allowing her sister to orchestrate my banishment like a meticulously controlled marionette directed by a designer puppeteer. Radio silence, a complete and utter absence of communication, which revealed to me the true extent of my 3-year marital commitment in her estimation. Apparently, discarding one's husband was comparable to disposing of outdated furniture. Once it's gone, its presence rarely occupies one's thoughts. But Sabrina was reveling in the apex of her existence. Social media transformed into her personal victory parade, and I was afforded a front row seat to the entire spectacle from my designated position in Loserville. Instagram stories showcasing extravagant luncheons accompanied by captions such as, "Immensely grateful for family who truly support you." Facebook posts decrying the toxicity of certain individuals and extolling the virtues of shedding dead weight for personal growth. Twitter updates championing strong women who merit superior treatment. Each individual post felt like a deliberate digital affront aimed directly at me. And the most galling aspect, she was conducting all of this under the guise of Clara's accounts, at Clara's events, utilizing Clara's financial resources. The unemployed sister, who had never earned a day's wage, was now functioning as a social media influencer, leveraging another's accomplishments. And inexplicably, I was cast as the antagonist in this narrative. However, instead of succumbing to rage, a reaction characteristic of my former self, I began to cultivate curiosity. Because here's what failed to align. If I were truly such a reprehensible spouse, a deceitful, unfaithful, financially exploitative scoundrel, then why the conspicuous silence from Clara? Why wasn't she broadcasting her own triumphant, free at last declarations? Why was Sabrina engaging in all the public jubilations while Clara maintained such a remarkably reserved demeanor? It was at this juncture that I commenced paying meticulous attention to the minutiae. And let me assure you, when you've spent 2 decades of your career as a project manager dedicated to identifying and rectifying the errors of others, you develop an exceptionally keen eye for discrepancies. Consider, for instance, the unusual quietude emanating from Clara's company of late. No significant pronouncements, no groundbreaking advancements, no press releases trumpeting record-breaking quarterly earnings. For an individual who typically treated her business triumphs as a high-stakes contact sport, this silence was profoundly telling. Similarly, Sabrina's social media posts, while abundant and undeniably obnoxious, were consistently confined to a limited repertoire of locations. The penthouse, that exorbitantly priced Cafe Clara favored, and a handful of the same 3 or 4 restaurants. For someone purportedly living her best life, her mobility seemed remarkably restricted. Furthermore, not a single one of Clara's business associates or acquaintances had reached out to me. Not to offer condolences, not to inquire about the circumstances, not even to satisfy their curiosity regarding the burgeoning divorce rumors likely circulating through their social circles like wildfire. In a milieu where gossip propagates with the speed of a market crash, this pervasive silence was undeniably peculiar. Thus, I embarked on what I do best, research, not the clandestine, invasive form of investigation. I am by no means a psychopath, but rather the methodical, professional approach cultivated through years of managing intricate projects where a single overlooked detail can incur substantial financial repercussions for all parties involved. I commenced with the straightforward elements: publicly accessible records, corporate filings, any information legally available to those willing to undertake the effort of examination. And it was then that matters began to take a decidedly more intriguing turn. It transpired that Whitmore Luxury Real Estate had been navigating what could charitably be described as a challenging fiscal quarter. Several significant transactions had faltered. A number of key investors had withdrawn their capital, and a development project, Clara's passion project for the preceding 2 years, was encountering certain regulatory hurdles. Nothing catastrophic, certainly, but a far cry from the seamless progression Clara habitually experienced. Subsequently, I turned my attention to the prenuptial agreement. You recall the prenup, do you not? The very document Clara insisted upon during a period when our affection was so profound that she wished to ensure my financial security should anything transpire to jeopardize her corporate empire. The document she drafted at a time when her emotions, rather than her sister's paranoid delusions, guided her decisions. Here's a crucial detail about prenuptial agreements that often eludes general comprehension. Their purpose extends beyond the protection of the affluent party from the less financially endowed. In certain instances, contingent upon their specific wording and the timing of their execution, they can function in the inverse, particularly when the financially privileged spouse initiates divorce proceedings based on unfounded allegations and demonstrates an unwillingness to engage in counseling or mediation. I devoted countless hours to poring over that document, and permit me to state unequivocally, 3 years prior, Clara was an entirely different individual compared to her current iteration. 3 years ago, Clara was deeply enamored and desirous of instilling a sense of security within our marriage for me. She had meticulously incorporated clauses designed to safeguard me should she ever exhibit abusive, controlling, or unfaithful tendencies. She had stipulated provisions for substantial spousal support should the dissolution of our marriage stem from her own misconduct or unreasonable comportment. Unreasonable comportment, such as, for example, expelling one's husband from their shared residence based on the unsubstantiated claims of a parasitic relative without any empirical evidence of genuine wrongdoing, and exhibiting an absolute refusal to engage in constructive problem solving like mature adults. The present-day Clara had likely completely forgotten those specific clauses. Her focus had been so intensely directed toward shielding her assets from a hypothetical errant husband that she had inadvertently constructed a legal safeguard for the devoted husband she was now poised to discard. Concurrently with my discovery of this rather intriguing legal nuance, I also began meticulously documenting every relevant detail. Screenshots of Sabrina's social media pronouncements, with a particular emphasis on those that could be construed as harassment or defamation. Records of all my earnest attempts to establish communication with Clara and resolve our issues. Evidence substantiating my actual whereabouts during the periods when Sabrina alleged I was engaged in extramarital affairs or conducting clandestine business meetings. And gradually, discreetly, and with methodical precision, I commenced constructing a case that would have elicited pride from my former law school professors, not out of a desire for retribution against anyone. I am not inherently a vindictive individual. Rather, it was because I had finally reached a point where I was unwilling to continue serving as the victim in someone else's dysfunctional family saga. The telephone call from Clara arrived on a Tuesday morning, precisely 3 weeks subsequent to my forced departure. I was seated in my kitchen enjoying a cup of coffee and perusing some particularly compelling financial documents I had requested from our accountant when my phone vibrated with her name displayed. For a fleeting instant, I contemplated disregarding the call, but an insatiable curiosity ultimately prevailed. Marcus, her voice sounded distinctly altered, softer, tinged with an unmistakable uncertainty. We need to confer. Have you afforded yourself adequate time for reflection? She inquired. Reflection? As if I were a misbehaving child who had been confined to his room for contemplation of his transgressions. Indeed, Clara, I replied, carefully maintaining a perfectly neutral tone. I have had ample opportunity for reflection. Excellent, she responded. Would you be amenable to visiting my office tomorrow, perhaps around 2 o'clock? I believe it would be beneficial for us to discuss our path forward. Path forward. The subtext was obvious. She desired to ascertain if I was prepared to return in a subservient capacity, offer apologies for transgressions I had not committed, and likely execute some form of agreement that would permit her to initiate divorce proceedings while preserving her moral high ground. I shall be there, I affirmed. And indeed I would be, though not for the reasons she surmised. It was time to demonstrate to Clara and her manipulative sister the precise outcomes of 3 weeks of dedicated reflection. You are familiar with that sensation when playing poker, holding a royal flush, yet compelled to maintain a stoic expression as your fellow players believe they are on the verge of depleting your resources. That was precisely the sentiment I experienced that morning in my rather unremarkable apartment following Clara's telephone call. I was sipping coffee that possessed a flavor suggestive of filtration through worn athletic socks, while mentally preparing for the performance of a lifetime. Clara had requested a meeting at her office. Naturally she would. Why conduct a personal discussion regarding the implosion of one's marriage in a neutral venue when the executive boardroom, where she wielded absolute authority, was readily available? It was a quintessential Clara maneuver. Control the environment, control the narrative, control the outcome. She had likely rehearsed her entire discourse, perhaps even scheduled it between her 10 o'clock engagement with the Peterson account and her 3:30 meeting with the city planning committee. Have you afforded yourself adequate time for reflection? She had posed as if I were some errant employee who had been temporarily suspended pending a performance evaluation. The sheer audacity of that inquiry was, frankly, astonishing. Here was a woman who had unceremoniously evicted her husband from their shared residence based solely on the assertion of her perpetually dependent sister, and she was inquiring if I had, by chance, learned my lesson. Oh, I had indeed reflected, profoundly so. I had reflected with such intensity that I might as well have been a seasoned philosopher at this juncture. I spent the morning preparing myself as if for an impending conflict, which in a sense it was. A thorough shower, a meticulous shave, the entire grooming regimen. I donned my most impeccable suit, the charcoal gray ensemble Clara had gifted me for her company's annual gala the previous year, a time when she still took evident pride in my presence as her escort at her professional functions. It was, in hindsight, rather ironic. I was about to leverage her own gift to project an image of professionalism while systematically dismantling the assumptions that had precipitated this current predicament. The briefcase served as the pivotal prop in today's unfolding drama. Fashioned from rich black leather and exuding an air of expensive taste, it was the sort of accessory that unequivocally conveyed serious business in any corporate setting. Clara had presented it to me on our second anniversary, back when she found the idea of having a project manager as a husband to be charming rather than a source of potential embarrassment. Within its confines, I had meticulously arranged all the research I had compiled over the preceding 3 weeks. Copies of the prenuptial agreement with the pertinent sections highlighted, financial statements, bank records, screenshots of documentation, verifying my actual whereabouts during the periods of my alleged infidelity. However, the true brilliance of my preparation lay not in what I had included, but rather in what I had deliberately omitted. For sometimes the most effective strategy involves refraining from revealing your entire hand prematurely. Sometimes it is about allowing your opponents to believe they comprehend your holdings while you retain the royal flush concealed until the opportune moment. I arrived at Clara's office building approximately 20 minutes prior to our scheduled meeting. Punctuality, after all, was one of those ingrained middle-class habits I had never managed to relinquish. Even after years of residing in the penthouse, the lobby exuded an aura of marble and glass, coupled with an aggressively minimalist aesthetic that screamed, "We command exorbitant fees, and we are worth every single cent." The security guard offered a knowing nod as if he recognized me, which he likely did from my numerous previous visits, whether to surprise Clara with an impromptu lunch, a bouquet of flowers, or simply to offer support during her particularly demanding weeks. Those bygone days now felt as if they belonged to an entirely different life. I ascended in the elevator to the 15th floor, the ambient soundscape filled with the generic jazz music, designed to cultivate an illusion of sophistication while one awaits the inevitable moment of being financially exploited by individuals attired in expensive suits. The receptionist, Jessica, if I recall her name correctly, greeted me with that practiced professional warmth that never quite reaches the eyes. "Mr. Hale, it has been some time. Mrs. Whitmore is expecting you. Conference room A." Conference room A, the expansive one. The room boasting floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding vista of the city. The very room where Clara convened her most critical meetings with investors and city officials. She wasn't merely arranging a meeting with me. She was making a profound statement. This was now a matter of business, not personal sentiment. I was being summoned to the principal's office to address my supposed behavioral deficiencies. I took a seat in the waiting area, observing Clara's employees as they went about their daily routines. These were individuals I had encountered at company gatherings, people who had extended their congratulations upon Clara and my wedding, individuals who had undoubtedly been engaged in fervent gossip regarding my mysterious disappearance over the past 3 weeks. I wondered how many of them were privy to the actual sequence of events versus Sabrina's fabricated version. I pondered how many of them genuinely cared. The inherent nature of corporate environments is such that they possess an uncanny ability to imbue even the most trivial matters with an air of significance and officialdom, even when it is merely personal drama disguised in professional attire. However, that formality operates on a dual basis. If Clara was inclined to treat this encounter as a business negotiation, then I was fully prepared to deliver the complete professional experience. My phone buzzed, indicating an incoming text message from my legal counsel. Documents are prepared and ready at your convenience. Give them hell. Documents, plural. Because while Clara had been expending the past 3 weeks basking in her perceived victory over the purported villainous husband, I had been undertaking an action she had apparently failed to anticipate. I had sought and secured legal counsel from an individual possessing genuine expertise in the field. Precisely at 2:00, Jessica reappeared at my side, her professional smile firmly in place. Mrs. Whitmore is prepared to see you now. I followed her down the corridor, passing motivational posters, prestigious awards, and numerous photographs depicting Clara engaging in handshakes with various distinguished-looking individuals. This was her domain, her personal kingdom, her meticulously constructed monument to success and control. And within approximately 10 minutes, I intended to reveal the precise extent of her actual dominion over this particular situation. The conference room door swung open, and there she was, Clara, seated at the head of the expansive mahogany table, as if presiding over a board meeting rather than engaging in a conversation with her estranged husband. She looked remarkably well. She always did, but there was a subtle alteration in her facial expression, perhaps fatigue or a manifestation of stress. The preceding 3 weeks had clearly not been as effortless as she had endeavored to portray. And positioned to her right, like some malevolent advisor, was Sabrina. Because, of course, Sabrina was present, naturally, the architect of this entire imbroglio would wish to witness my impending humiliation firsthand. She appeared to be preparing to broadcast the entire encounter live. Marcus, Clara stated, gesturing towards the chair opposite her. Please have a seat. I complied, carefully placing my briefcase on the table. Both women regarded it with a degree of curiosity, likely speculating on what pitiful assortment of apologies and assurances I had brought to mend our fractured relationship. Thank you for attending, Clara continued, seamlessly adopting her CEO persona as if donning a well-worn coat. I trust the past few weeks have afforded you ample opportunity to reflect on all that has transpired between us, all that had transpired as if our marriage had simply imploded rather than being systematically dismantled by the woman seated beside her. Oh, I certainly have been contemplating, I replied, maintaining a calm and pleasant tone. My thoughts have been quite occupied. Sabrina leaned forward subtly, a familiar smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She was clearly relishing the situation, anticipating my eventual breakdown and pleas for absolution, while she assumed the role of the protective sister who had rescued Clara from a dreadful error. Excellent, Clara said, because I believe we need to establish a clear path forward regarding this situation, our marriage, our living arrangements, our shared future. Our future. The way she uttered it, with that slight hesitation, revealed precisely the kind of future she envisioned. A divorce was probable, with me accepting full culpability for the entire debacle. A settlement was likely, heavily skewed in her favor. A narrative would emerge portraying her as the accomplished businesswoman exploited by a fortune-seeking husband, with Sabrina as the devoted sibling who had attempted to caution her. It was a well-crafted plan, neat, straightforward, and effective. Unfortunately for them, I had dedicated the preceding 3 weeks to devising a superior strategy. Actually, Clara, I interjected, reaching for my briefcase, I believe you are quite correct. We do need to discuss our future, and I have brought along some materials that I believe will provide a clearer picture of precisely what that future will entail. The briefcase snapped open with a sound that seemed to reverberate in the sudden quiet of the room. Both women now fixed their gaze upon me, their expressions having shifted from confident assuredness to an unmistakable hint of apprehension. Before we commence, I added, retrieving a neatly arranged stack of documents, I wish to state that I have engaged in considerable introspection over the past 3 weeks, reflecting on our marriage, on the nature of trust, and on the consequences of making assumptions without first verifying the facts. I placed the papers on the table before us, meeting Clara's gaze directly for the first time since entering the room. And my conclusion is that you are absolutely right. We do indeed need to determine how we will proceed from this point. I slid the documents across the table towards her, a smile gracing my lips that was likely far more assured than I actually felt. Beginning with these, I said, I would appreciate your signature on these divorce proceedings. Do you recall that decisive moment in chess when you strategically position your queen and your opponent abruptly realizes they have been playing a far simpler game all along? Clara's face mirrored that precise realization as those divorce papers landed on the polished mahogany with the understated impact of a legal document cloaked in the guise of a nuclear detonation. The silence that descended upon that conference room was so palpable, one could have sliced it with a blunt instrument and served it as an amuse-bouche at one of Clara's extravagant corporate functions. Both women stared at the documents as if I had produced a live serpent from my briefcase, rather than a meticulously prepared legal filing crafted by one of the city's most esteemed divorce attorneys. Clara's hand hovered above the papers, as though she feared they might ignite upon contact. Her impeccably maintained CEO facade began to show hairline fractures at the edges. I could almost visualize the gears churning within her mind as she struggled to comprehend how the meeting had so rapidly spiraled out of her control. Sabrina, on the other hand, appeared as though she had just been informed that Christmas had been canceled and her inheritance had been irrevocably donated to charity. The smirk that had been practically glued to her face for the past 3 weeks had completely vanished, replaced by an expression oscillating between bewilderment and outright terror. What is this?" Clara finally managed to stammer, a subtle tremor in her voice betraying the fact that I had indeed managed to unsettle her in a manner that likely hadn't occurred since her inaugural board meeting 2 decades prior. "Those are divorce papers," I stated helpfully, as if elucidating elementary arithmetic to a particularly slow kindergarten student. "You know, the legal instruments that formally dissolve a marriage when one partner opts to expel the other from their shared residence based on entirely fabricated allegations." I maintained a pleasant conversational tone, the same inflection I might employ when discussing the weather or requesting the salt. Professional courtesy, one might say. After all, we are operating within a professional context, and I am committed to upholding appropriate workplace etiquette, even when systematically dismantling someone's preconceived notions of how this conversation is destined to unfold. Clara picked up the papers, her hands betraying a noticeable lack of their former steadiness. Her eyes began to scan the initial page, and I observed a fascinating progression of expressions play across her face as the gravity of the situation gradually took hold. Confusion yielded to astonishment. Astonishment gave way to disbelief, and disbelief was rapidly morphing into what bore a striking resemblance to the nascent stages of sheer panic. Marcus, she articulated slowly, as if coaxing a skittish horse away from a precipice. Surely we can address this like mature individuals. There is no necessity for legal representation or formal proceedings. We can reach a private resolution. Privately. This translated to she desired to negotiate this entanglement behind closed doors, where she could dictate the narrative and mitigate reputational damage, framing it as a mutual understanding rather than the catastrophic unraveling it truly was. Oh, we most certainly can discuss this like adults, I concurred cheerfully. In fact, that is precisely what we are doing at this very moment. You are an adult. I am an adult. And these are the adult repercussions for adult choices. It is rather amusing, is it not? Sabrina had remained unusually quiet throughout this exchange, a development that should have served as my initial premonition of her impending, spectacularly ill-advised action. However, I was so captivated by witnessing Clara's world crumble in real time that I failed to perceive the brewing storm in the cheaper seats until it was irrevocably too late. "You cannot do this," Sabrina suddenly erupted, slamming her perfectly manicured hand onto the table with enough force to jolt the water glasses. "You cannot simply waltz in here and demolish my sister's life because you were apprehended in the act." And there it was. The mask had been completely discarded. Sabrina was now revealing her true manipulative nature in all its unvarnished ugliness. The pretense of the concerned sibling had evaporated. The subtle poison whispered into Clara's ear was gone. This was pure, unadulterated fury from someone who had just realized her meticulously constructed edifice of deceit was teetering on the brink of collapse. "Apprehended in the act of doing what precisely?" I inquired, turning to face her directly for the first time since this entire spectacle had commenced. "Please enlighten me. What exactly was I caught doing?" "You know precisely what you did," she shrieked, her voice ascending to a pitch that likely set dogs howling several blocks away. "The affairs, the financial discrepancies, the fabrications." "Which specific affairs?" I interrupted calmly. "The ones where I was allegedly observed at Cafe Milano when, in reality, I was participating in a conference with witnesses who can attest to my presence? Or perhaps you are referring to the mysterious blonde individual who turned out to be a barista at Starbucks, incapable of correctly spelling my name on a coffee cup." Sabrina's face was contorting into an interesting shade of crimson that clashed spectacularly with her designer attire. "The fund transfers, the clandestine accounts, You mean my anniversary savings account?" I interjected, retrieving my phone and opening my banking application with theatrical precision. "The one designated for the anniversary trip, which I was utilizing to surprise Clara with a romantic getaway. Would you prefer to view the screenshots, or shall I forward them directly to Clara's legal counsel?" This was the exquisite beauty of confronting pathological liars. They never anticipated the existence of tangible evidence supporting one's narrative. They became so accustomed to operating within a realm of veiled suggestions and manufactured drama that they overlooked the fact that ordinary individuals maintain records of financial statements and work schedules. Clara was still perusing the divorce documents, and I could discern she had reached the more salient points by the transformation of her complexion from pale to an almost spectral hue. She was examining the prenuptial agreement clauses, those meticulously detailed stipulations outlining the consequences of a marriage dissolution attributed to the undue conduct of the affluent spouse. Undue conduct such as neglecting to investigate accusations before acting upon them. such as expelling one's spouse from their marital abode without justification, such as prioritizing the word of a financially dependent relative over the individual to whom one had pledged to love, honor, and cherish until death. "Marcus," Clara murmured softly, and for the first time in months her voice resonated with the woman I had married rather than the CEO who had been interrogating me over dinner for weeks. These clauses, I do not recall agreeing to these terms. "You insisted upon them," I reminded her gently. "You stated you wished for me to feel secure within our marriage. You expressed that you never wanted me to fear that you might wield your wealth as a weapon against me should circumstances become challenging." The irony was so potent, it could have been utilized for road construction. Clara had been so consumed with shielding me from a hypothetical future Clara that she had inadvertently prepared for this precise scenario. Sabrina was now leaning over Clara's shoulder, and I observed her complexion shift from flushed to pallid, then to an unsettling shade of green as she grasped the implications of the highlighted sections. Her sister, her financial benefactor, her source of income, her entire lifestyle was poised to undergo a significant and likely unwelcome devaluation, and all of it stemmed from the fabrications Sabrina herself had orchestrated. "Clara, you cannot sign that," Sabrina whispered urgently. "There must be an alternative." "Fight what?" Clara inquired, her voice possessing a hollow, defeated quality. "Fight the prenuptial agreement I insisted upon. Fight the documented evidence that Marcus was not, in fact, unfaithful. Fight the fact that I banished my husband from our home based on accusations I failed to substantiate." She looked up at me, and for a fleeting moment I glimpsed the woman I had fallen in love with 4 years prior. The one who was brilliant and successful, yet beneath that veneer of corporate resilience possessed an underlying vulnerability and uncertainty. "How much?" she asked quietly. I feigned contemplation for a brief interval, despite having committed every clause and calculation to memory weeks ago. "According to the prenuptial agreement you drafted and considering the circumstances of our separation, the monthly spousal support amounts to approximately 30% of your net income for the next 5 years, coupled with a lump sum payment of $2.4 million due within 60 days of the divorce decree." Sabrina emitted a sound akin to someone choking on their own vocal cords. $2.4 million. "Clara, you cannot possibly afford that. The business, the expenditures, the gambling debts," I suggested helpfully. "Ah, yes, those are certainly matters we must address." Both women fell utterly still. Even the air in the room seemed to suspend its movement, as if the entire edifice held its breath in anticipation of what would transpire next. "Gambling debts," Clara repeated slowly. And at that precise instant, I knew I had them precisely where I desired them. The true entertainment was about to commence. Have you ever witnessed a controlled demolition on television? Where they detonate an aged structure, and it collapses in slow motion, floor by floor, until nothing remains but dust and debris. That was precisely the effect on Sabrina Whitmore's composure when I introduced the phrase "gambling debts" into that conference room, akin to a stick of dynamite with an alarmingly short fuse. The transformation was, quite frankly, spectacular. One moment she was seated there, attempting to maintain the facade of the solicitous sister, clinging to the vestiges of her victim narrative. The next, she was launching herself from her chair as if the upholstery had been electrified. "You absolute bastard," she screamed. And I do mean screamed. the kind of vocalization that likely sent every canine within a 5-block radius scrambling for cover. You lying, manipulative wretch, you cannot prove anything. Ah, but therein lies the delightful irony of gambling addicts, particularly those who believe themselves intellectually superior to all others. They invariably leave a trail of evidence that rivals the length of a receipt from a Black Friday shopping spree at a department store. And when that evidence involves pilfering funds from one sister's corporate accounts to fuel their addiction, well, that trail transforms from mere breadcrumbs into illuminated highway markers pointing directly towards federal penitentiary. Clara was staring at Sabrina as if she were encountering her for the very first time. Gambling debts, Clara stated, her voice tinged with disbelief. Sabrina, what is he talking about? Nothing, Sabrina retorted, but her voice had ascended several octaves, a characteristic seldom exhibited by individuals asserting their innocence when confronted with accusations. He is fabricating this. He is attempting to deflect from his own transgressions by blaming me for fictitious crimes. My transgressions, I interrupted, reaching back into my miraculous briefcase of truth bombs. You mean like this? I produced a manila folder, its thickness substantial enough to potentially incapacitate a large animal, and placed it gently on the table between us. The ensuing silence was so profound, I could discern the subtle hum of the overhead air conditioning. These are bank statements, I explained conversationally, as if discussing the prevailing weather conditions rather than orchestrating the demolition of someone's entire existence. Not mine, naturally, as you have already established that my financial affairs are transparent. These pertain to several offshore accounts that were established utilizing Clara's business credit and social security number. Clara's complexion shifted from pale to an almost spectral white. What are you referring to, Marcus? Well, it is rather intriguing, I continued, unfolding the documents with the delicate precision one might employ when handling ancient manuscripts. It appears that someone has been systematically transferring funds from Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's operating accounts into these offshore holdings for the past 18 months. Modest sums initially, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, but progressively increasing in both frequency and magnitude. Sabrina was now on her feet, receding from the table, as if the papers themselves possessed a radioactive aura. You cannot, that is not, how did I obtain these? I offered her a smile, radiating the genial warmth of a shark who had just identified a vulnerable seal. It's a curious phenomenon, you see. When one is married to a chief executive officer, one accumulates a network of contacts within the financial investigation industry. It turns out when one compensates the appropriate individuals sufficiently, they are capable of tracing virtually any financial irregularity back to its origin. I presented another sheet. This one was adorned with highlighted sections, resembling a Christmas tree that had undergone an explosion. This particular account exhibits regular withdrawals from various establishments in Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and my personal favorite, an online poker platform designated Lucky Lady's Last Chance. A rather sophisticated appellation, wouldn't you agree? Quite subtle. Clara was now reading over my shoulder, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid, as if an unseen force were gradually extracting the very air from the room. Sabrina, please tell me this is not what it appears to be. It is not what it appears to be, Sabrina shrieked, yet she continued to retreat towards the exit, her posture suggesting an imminent attempt at escape. He has fabricated all of this. He is attempting to incriminate me, because he knows he has been discovered. It was at this juncture that I retrieved my phone and accessed the photo gallery with a flourish that would have impressed even Shakespeare. "You know, Sabrina," I mused, "for someone who claims to be framed, you certainly do take an abundance of selfies at casino tables." The photographs were remarkably clear, depicting Sabrina luxuriating at blackjack tables, slot machines, and poker games, all meticulously tagged with locations and timestamps that corresponded precisely with the dates of the anomalous account withdrawals. Social media, it turned out, had been her undoing. She had been so exceedingly proud of her high-stakes lifestyle that she had documented each gambling session as if creating evidence for her own prosecution. "These are from your Instagram account," I explained helpfully to Clara, who was scrutinizing the images as if they depicted her sister committing acts of extreme violence. Apparently, Sabrina deemed her gambling escapades worthy of global dissemination. Quite community-minded of her, it certainly expedited my investigator's task considerably. Clara's voice had diminished to a mere whisper. "You stole from my company. You stole from me." "I did not steal anything," Sabrina asserted, her breathing now escalating to a full-blown hyperventilation. Her designer garment adhered to her skin with perspiration, despite the air conditioning that was likely set to subarctic temperatures. "It was merely borrowing. I intended to repay it. I was on a winning streak." "A winning streak," I repeated, and I confess my laughter was not particularly pleasant. "According to these records, you have incurred losses amounting to approximately $473,000 over the past 18 months. If that constitutes a winning streak, I shudder to contemplate what you would consider a losing streak." The figure struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She actually staggered backward, instinctively reaching for the edge of the conference table to steady herself. $473,000, Sabrina, that represents nearly half of our emergency operating fund." "It would have been more," I added cheerfully, "but the accounts were flagged by the fraud prevention system last month. It appears banks tend to become rather circumspect when an individual suddenly initiates substantial transfers to offshore gambling platforms. Who would have anticipated?" It was then that Sabrina completely lost what remained of her composure. She began to shriek, not with articulate words, but with a pure, inarticulate vocalization of rage. And before anyone could react, she seized the water pitcher from the table and hurled it at me with an accuracy that suggested prior practice. I ducked. The pitcher shattered against the wall behind me in a remarkably satisfying explosion of glass and water. Suddenly, the conference room resembled the aftermath of a significant meteorological event. "You destroyed everything," she screamed, advancing towards me with her hands curled into claws, as if intending to inflict physical harm upon my eyes. "Everything I worked for, everything I built." "Everything you built." Clara's voice sliced through the chaos like a blade through silk. "You built nothing, Sabrina. You have never labored a single day in your life. You have been subsisting on my wealth, pilfering from my company, and apparently deceiving me about everything for years." The sisters now faced each other across the wreckage of the conference room, and the familial resemblance had never been more pronounced. They shared the same bone structure, the same general build, yet Clara exuded strength and determination, while Sabrina appeared as though those qualities had been perverted into something desperate and ugly. "I protected you from him," Sabrina shrieked, pointing at me as if I were the embodiment of evil. "He was exploiting you. He was going to seize everything you had labored for." The only individual who has been appropriating everything I have labored for is you, Clara retorted, her voice possessing that sharp edge that invariably caused business adversaries to break out in a cold sweat. I concluded that this was likely an opportune moment to intervene before anyone required medical attention. Clara, I believe we should contact security and likely the authorities. Perpetrating fraud is a serious offense, and an assault involving a water pitcher certainly constitutes at least a minor transgression. The mention of the police seemed to jolt Sabrina back to some semblance of awareness. Her advance towards me ceased, and she began scanning the room as if only just realizing the extent of her predicament. "CL, please," she implored. Her voice suddenly was no longer furious but small and laced with desperation. "I'm your sister. We're family. We can resolve this. I can seek help. I'll attend therapy, join Gamblers Anonymous, anything you deem necessary. Just don't." "Don't what?" Clara interjected. "Don't hold me accountable for pilfering from you. Don't expect me to face repercussions for dismantling my marriage. Don't demand explanations for why you've been deceitful for months on end." Sabrina's spirit seemed to falter entirely, as if a switch had been flicked off. She slumped back into her chair, tears commencing. These were not the elegant, dainty tears of a cinematic heroine, but rather the messy, mucus-laden, mascara-streaked sobs of someone whose world had imploded within a mere 10 minutes. Clara observed her sister for a considerable pause before turning to me, her expression unreadable. "Marcus," she stated softly, "I owe you an apology, a profound apology, yet I was far from finished. Not by a long shot." "Actually, Clara," I countered, meticulously gathering my documents, "I believe what you owe me is your signature on those divorce papers. The true reckoning was only just beginning." You know the adage about truth being stranger than fiction? Well, let me assure you. After dedicating 3 weeks to scrutinizing Sabrina Whitmore's financial dealings, I began to suspect that whoever coined that phrase had demonstrably never encountered an individual whose entire existence was constructed upon a foundation of deception, larceny, and what I can only characterize as weaponized ineptitude. However, here's the curious nature of individuals like Sabrina. They rarely confine themselves to a single transgression. Their criminal behavior is akin to potato chips. One cannot simply partake once. And as I witnessed her theatrical breakdown in Clara's executive suite, I realized I hadn't even delved into the most sensational details. My legal counsel had performed admirably. He operated like a financial archaeologist, excavating through strata of falsehoods to unearth fraudulent artifacts that would have impressed the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime unit. While Sabrina continued to blubber in her seat and Clara regarded her sibling as if encountering her for the first time, I reached back into my briefcase once more. "Indeed," I announced, withdrawing another file, considerably thicker than the first. "The gambling compulsion is merely the surface-level issue." Clara's eyes widened to an alarming degree, as if threatening to dislodge. "There is more. Oh, my dear, there is so much more." I opened the new dossier with the solemnity typically reserved for handling volatile materials. You see, when one engages a truly exceptional financial investigator, and I mean truly exceptional, the kind whose daily rate eclipses many individuals' monthly earnings, they transcend mere superficial analysis. They probe deeper, following financial trails imperceptible to the average person. Sabrina had ceased her weeping and was now fixing me with a gaze usually reserved for those realizing they are participants in a horror film and decidedly not the sole survivor. What I uncovered, I continued, arranging the documents as if dealing a winning hand in the world's most exorbitant poker tournament, is that our estimable Sabrina has been operating what could be termed a diversified portfolio of fraud. The initial document presented was a credit report that appeared to have been subjected to a paper shredder and subsequently reassembled by someone experiencing a severe mental episode. 17 credit cards had been opened under Clara's name, boasting a combined credit limit exceeding $600,000. Clara's countenance cycled through a fascinating spectrum of emotions, as if experiencing every phase of grief concurrently. Credit cards in my own name, naturally all maxed out, I added with feigned cheerfulness. The monthly remittances have been automatically debited from Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's accounts for the past 2 years. Your accounting department likely classified them as legitimate operational expenditures. I produced another document, liberally adorned with colored highlights to the point of resembling an abstract art piece. Then there are the loans, personal loans, commercial loans, and something designated as a luxury lifestyle advance from an entity I suspect consists of merely 3 individuals operating from a basement, charging interest rates that would make loan sharks recoil in embarrassment. Sabrina emitted soft whimpering sounds, reminiscent of a canine anticipating an unpleasant veterinary visit. Clara, conversely, adopted that intense demeanor she exhibited when poised to dominate a business negotiation. "How much?" Clara inquired, her voice devoid of all inflection, a clear indicator to anyone familiar with her that this was an exceptionally dire sign. I feigned a consultation of my notes, despite having the figures memorized to the cent. Well, when we factor in the gambling deficits, the credit card obligations, the assorted loan amounts, and the compound interest accrued on all of it, we are looking at approximately $1.2 million, potentially extending to $1.5 million in total debt, systematically transferred onto your personal and business credit lines. The ensuing silence was punctuated by the distant chime of an elevator in the corridor. Clara stared at the documents as if they were inscribed in an unknown tongue, while Sabrina contemplated the distinct possibility that leaping from the 15th story window might be a preferable alternative to whatever was about to unfold. "But wait," I continued, "there's more. Because when you're dealing with someone who has spent years perfecting the art of financial parasitism, you don't stop at simple larceny. You branch out into more inventive endeavors." "Oh, and then there's the real estate," I announced, presenting what appeared to be a substantial collection of property deeds and mortgage agreements. It transpires that Sabrina has been a rather ambitious entrepreneur in the property investment sector. Clara's head snapped up. "What property?" 3 condominiums in Miami, a coastal residence in the Hamptons, and my personal favorite, a timeshare in Aspen that, according to the documentation, includes a dedicated private ski instructor. I laid out the paperwork with the meticulous care one would employ when handling evidence at a crime scene, all acquired through loans secured against Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's assets. "That's impossible," Clara stated, though her conviction wavered. "I would have had to authorize any loans using company assets as collateral." I retrieved a magnifying glass. Indeed, I procured a magnifying glass specifically because, at times, one must embrace the theatrical. "Please examine the signature line." Clara scrutinized the signature under magnification, and I observed her expression shift from bewilderment to comprehension to sheer unadulterated fury within approximately 10 seconds. "This is my signature," she declared quietly. "Technically, yes," I conceded, "but unless you've developed a sudden, unmentioned fondness for timeshares and beachfront properties, I suspect you did not personally affix your name to these documents." Forgery. We had officially transcended simple theft and entered the realm of federal offenses, and judging by Sabrina's pallor, she was beginning to grasp that her troubles had escalated from an uncomfortable family dinner discussion to the distinct possibility of spending the next decade incarcerated in an orange jumpsuit. "Sabrina," Clara stated, her voice so frigid it could have liquefied nitrogen, "did you forge my signature?" "I can explain," Sabrina blurted out, finally regaining her voice as she faced the prospect of serious legal repercussions. "It wasn't intended to be permanent. I was going to repay everything. The timeshare was an investment. The condominiums were appreciating in value. It was all going to work out." "You forged my signature to steal over $1 million, Clara articulated slowly, as if weighing each word for its veracity. "You undermined my marriage through deceit while you were systematically defrauding me. You've subsisted on my wealth, slept in a bed I provided, consumed provisions I purchased, all while methodically dismantling everything I've strived to achieve." The unraveling of their familial bond was occurring in real time, and it was frankly captivating to observe. 28 years of sisterly connection built on mutual trust, familial loyalty, and shared childhood recollections were crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence, demonstrating Sabrina's prolonged exploitation of Clara as her personal financial resource. "Clara, I'm your sister," Sabrina wailed, deploying her final gambit with the desperation of someone who has just realized they hold a losing hand. "Family, blood, that must hold some significance." "You're correct," Clara responded, rising deliberately and approaching Sabrina's huddled form. "It does hold significance. It makes your actions all the more egregious." She retrieved her phone and began dialing. "Who are you calling?" Sabrina queried, though I suspected the answer was obvious to all present. "The authorities," Clara replied calmly, "and then my attorney, followed by my accountant and subsequently the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as I'm fairly certain your actions have spanned state lines, rendering it a federal offense." Sabrina resumed crying, but this time it was devoid of the prior anger and frustration. This was the desperate, despondent weeping of someone who comprehends that their entire life has imploded, with no possibility of restoration. Clara met my gaze across the disarray of the conference room, across the shattered remnants of my marriage and her relationship with her sister. For the first time in months, I perceived an expression in her eyes that bore a resemblance to respect. "Marcus," she murmured, "I need to ask you something, and I require your complete honesty." I waited. Is there any possibility, even the slightest chance, that we could find a way to rectify this? And in that moment, I knew I had her precisely where I intended. You're familiar with that scene in virtually every revenge narrative, where the protagonist has the antagonist cornered and you anticipate whether mercy or retribution will prevail. Allow me to enlighten you about the realities of life. Sometimes the most devastating action one can take is not annihilation. Occasionally, it is simply to disengage and allow individuals to confront the repercussions of their own choices. Clara gazed at me, her large, pleading eyes, the same ones that had once melted my resolve like butter on hot toast, the same eyes that had inspired my proposal, that had convinced me I was the most fortunate man alive when she accepted, the same eyes that had looked at me with such profound love an unwavering trust during our wedding ceremony, bringing tears to my eyes in the presence of 300 influential figures of Manhattan. Now, those identical eyes implored me to salvage her from the devastation she herself had wrought. "Is there any chance we could fix this?" she had asked, her voice imbued with a hope so fragile it was nearly heartbreaking. "Almost." I rose slowly, gathering my papers with the same deliberate precision that had characterized this entire spectacular display. Each document was returned to its designated folder. Each folder was placed back into the briefcase. Every piece of evidence that had just obliterated her world was neatly stashed away, as if I were tidying up after a remarkably successful business presentation. "Fix this," I echoed, testing the phrase as if deciphering an unfamiliar language. "CL, my dear, I'm uncertain you truly comprehend the nature of this situation anymore." Behind her, Sabrina had finally managed to suppress her tears long enough to focus on our exchange, and I could discern a desperate calculation in her eyes. She was likely contemplating that if Clara and I reconciled, she might somehow extricate herself from the legal quagmire she had engineered. Perhaps her elder sister would once again offer protection, cover her transgressions, and find a means to make all the unpleasantries vanish, as had always been the case. Unfortunately for Sabrina, those days were irrevocably concluded. "I acknowledge my errors, Clara," I stated, and I must give her credit. She was attempting to maintain a degree of composure despite the collapse of her entire world. "I recognize I placed my trust in the wrong individual. I should have heeded you instead of—" I gestured vaguely towards her sister, who remained huddled in her chair like a designer-clad gargoyle. "Instead of me," I completed her thought. "Instead of your husband, instead of the man to whom you vowed love, honor, and fidelity until death do us part. Instead of the individual who dedicated 3 years of his life to cultivating a relationship with you, while your sister systematically plundered your assets and poisoned your perception of me." Each word struck her like a physical blow, and I observed her flinch with every accusation. However, the immutable truth regarding consequences is that they are indifferent to sentiment. They disregard your remorse or the depth of your regret. They simply exist, weighty, permanent, and utterly unforgiving. "Marcus, please," she pleaded, genuine anguish now evident in her voice. "I was mistaken. I was profoundly mistaken about everything. But we can initiate anew. We can rebuild. I will rectify my errors." "Initiate anew?" I repeated, as if the preceding 3 months had been a minor disagreement rather than a complete character assassination orchestrated by the very person she had chosen to confide in over me, as if I could simply disregard the night she had expelled me from our home like refuse, the protracted silence, the absolute certainty in her tone when she declared Sabrina incapable of deceiving her on such a critical matter. "And precisely how do you intend to rectify this, Clara?" I inquired, closing the briefcase with a satisfying click that seemed to reverberate throughout the devastated conference room. "Will you restore the 3 years I spent married to someone willing to believe the worst of me without a scintilla of proof? Will you negate the humiliation of being ejected from my own residence? Will you somehow erase the fact that when faced with a critical decision, you prioritized your mendacious, thieving, manipulative sister over the husband who had never provided a single reason for you to doubt him?" The questions hung in the air, akin to the lingering smoke from a conflagration, and I could perceive Clara desperately seeking answers that simply did not exist. For that is the essence of trust. Once irrevocably fractured, All the apologies in the world cannot mend it. You may express regret. You may pledge improvement. You may even feel it with every fiber of your being. However, you cannot unlearn what you have discovered about someone's character when they revealed their true nature during a crisis. And Clara had unequivocally demonstrated hers when adversity struck. She was a person who would discard 3 years of marriage based on the word of an individual who had been perpetuating falsehoods about every other aspect of her life. That was no longer the person I wished to be married to. "I love you," she declared with the desperation of someone realizing the deck was stacked against them. "I know I made a mess of things, but I love you, Marcus. That has to count for something." I regarded her for an extended period. This woman who had been the focal point of my universe for 3 years, this brilliant, accomplished, formidable executive capable of negotiating multi-million-dollar deals in her sleep, yet incapable of discerning her own sister's pathetically transparent deceptions. And I felt utterly devoid of emotion, no anger, no heartache, no lingering affection, attempting to draw me back into the catastrophe she had engineered, merely a vast, empty sense of finality. "You know what, Clara," I stated, "I genuinely believe you perceive yourself to be in love with me. However, here is what I have discerned about your interpretation of love. It is contingent. It relies on the opinions of others. It dissipates the moment someone whispers something disparaging in your ear. That is not love, my dear. That is merely expediency with emotional attachments." Sabrina attempted to interject, likely hoping to salvage something from this wreckage, but I raised a hand, halting her abruptly. "And you," I declared, turning to face her directly, "you are not permitted to utter another word. You have spoken enough for a lifetime. Security will soon arrive to escort you out, and then you will spend the ensuing years explaining to various law enforcement agencies precisely how you rationalized stealing over $1 million from your sister as a sensible life choice." I retrieved my briefcase and proceeded towards the exit, leaving both women amidst the ruins of their relationships and Clara's corporate empire. However, just as I reached the doorway, Clara called out one last time, "Marcus, please don't depart like this. I was wrong about everything, but we can mend this. We can attend counseling. We can work through this. I will do anything." I paused, my hand on the doorknob, and turned back to look at her one final time. She was weeping now, silent tears tracing paths down her cheeks, likely costing more than most people's monthly salaries in ruined makeup. And for a fleeting moment, I nearly felt a pang of sympathy for her. Nearly. "Do you wish to know the truly lamentable aspect of all this, Clara?" I asked softly. "Had you simply inquired about any of those accusations, had you afforded me the opportunity to defend myself rather than deeming me guilty based on your sister's word, none of this would have transpired. Your marriage would remain intact, your business secure, and Sabrina would still be your concern rather than the FBI's." I opened the door, and the sounds of ordinary office life drifted in from the hallway. Telephones ringing, conversations about mundane matters, the blessed, unremarkable reality of a world where people were not systematically destroying each other's lives over fabricated betrayals. "But you elected to trust her over me," I continued. "You chose to believe the worst of the person who had never given you cause for doubt. And now you must live with the consequences of that decision." I exited that conference room, departed Clara's office building, and left behind the life I had constructed with someone who had transformed into a stranger, wearing the visage of the woman I had loved. Behind me, I could hear Sabrina commencing her wails once more, and Clara attempting to soothe her, but their voices diminished as I made my way to the elevator. The doors closed with a soft chime, and as I watched the floor indicators descend toward ground level, I experienced a surprising realization. I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since this entire ordeal commenced, I was liberated. You know the saying about revenge being a dish best served cold? Allow me to confirm, it is absolutely true. However, what they omit is that the most gratifying form of retribution is not retribution at all. Sometimes the most satisfying outcome is simply observing the universe address your adversaries while you are engaged in constructing a more fulfilling existence elsewhere. 6 months have elapsed since I departed Clara's conference room, and I must confess, the vista from my new reality is rather magnificent. I am seated in my new office, not the cramped downtown shoebox I occupied during the divorce proceedings, but a legitimate office with windows that actually open and a coffee maker that doesn't sound as if it's grappling with an existential crisis each time I operate it. The sign on the door proudly proclaims, "Hail Project Solutions," and business has exceeded my most optimistic projections. It transpires that when you spend 3 years married to one of the most influential figures in the city's corporate milieu, you cultivate a few valuable connections of your own. As soon as my network learned I was available for independent project management opportunities, and considering they'd long suspected me of being the mastermind behind some of Clara's most successful endeavors, my phone began ringing almost immediately after the divorce became official. It's a remarkable twist of fate. Clara herself used to jokingly refer to me as her hidden advantage in negotiations. She'd say I was the one who could foresee potential problems before they escalated and ensure complex projects stayed on track. While she intended it as praise, she was inadvertently broadcasting my capabilities to every significant figure in the New York City business landscape. Now those same individuals are my clients, and in a mere 6 months as a consultant, I've earned more than I did in 2 years as a full-time project manager. It turns out that my diligent middle-class work ethic and meticulous attention to detail are quite valuable assets when they aren't overshadowed by inherited wealth and privileged connections. Yet, the true fulfillment comes not from the financial gains, the success, or even the vindication of having been right all along. The genuine satisfaction lies in witnessing Clara's empire unravel in real time as I construct something stable and enduring with my own efforts. News of her downfall began to surface about a month after I departed. Dave from my former position contacted me, practically bursting with eagerness as he shared the latest whispers from the New York business circles. "You won't believe this," he exclaimed, "but Clara's company is in free fall. The fraud inquiry, the missing funds, the negative publicity. Investors are pulling out en masse." It all commenced with the financial institutions. Once they grasped the full extent of Sabrina's illicit financial activities, they started demanding loan repayments and freezing accounts with unprecedented speed. Clara found herself grappling with financial pressures that would overwhelm any small business owner. However, she was attempting to navigate this crisis while overseeing a real estate enterprise valued in the millions. Then came the clients. Affluent individuals detest uncertainty, and they particularly dislike engaging with businesses that attract negative headlines. When it became public that the chief executive of Whitmore Luxury Real Estate had been systematically defrauded by her own sister for nearly 2 years without detection, it hardly instilled confidence in Clara's business acumen. The shareholders were the next to voice their concerns. Board meetings devolved into intense confrontations as investors demanded explanations Clara couldn't provide and answers she lacked. How does one inform a room full of people who entrusted you with their capital that you were so preoccupied with fabrications about your husband that you completely overlooked your sister's blatant theft? The final blow came with the regulatory scrutiny. When federal agencies begin investigating your business practices, your innocence becomes secondary. The mere presence of an investigation is enough to deter anyone who might have otherwise endured the financial difficulties and negative press. Within 4 months, Clara had plummeted from the heights of New York real estate aristocracy to just another cautionary tale of failure, desperately seeking a buyer willing to acquire her debt-laden company for a pittance. The personal repercussions were equally dramatic to observe from a distance. Clara was compelled to sell the penthouse, the very same residence from which she had ejected me with such righteous conviction. She relocated to a modest apartment in Queens, an experience that must have felt like banishment for someone who had spent her entire adult life immersed in Manhattan's opulent lifestyle. The social circle she had meticulously cultivated over the years vanished overnight. It turns out that when you cease to be valuable to individuals who only valued your connections and your capacity to host lavish gatherings, those friendships evaporate more swiftly than complimentary champagne at a wedding reception. But the ultimate irony, the true pinnacle of this poetic justice, was what befell Sabrina. My attorney kept me apprised of her legal proceedings with a professional enthusiasm typically reserved for lottery winners. Federal charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and interstate embezzlement, the sort of accusations carrying mandatory minimum sentences and the distinct likelihood of spending the next decade explaining to fellow inmates why stealing from one's sister was considered a viable career path. Sabrina attempted to negotiate a plea deal, naturally offering to testify against Clara and asserting her sister's complicity in the financial schemes. However, the inherent flaw in being a compulsive liar who spent years manipulating everyone around you is that when you finally need people to believe you, you discover your credibility account is utterly depleted. The prosecutors were uninterested in her testimony because they couldn't trust anything she said. Her own defense counsel reportedly described her as the least credible witness in the history of federal criminal proceedings. And Clara, despite everything Sabrina had inflicted upon her, refused to abandon her sister entirely, which meant Sabrina couldn't even secure a deal through full cooperation. She received an 8-year sentence in federal prison, and from what I understand, she's struggling to adapt to a life devoid of credit cards and personal shoppers. Clara made several attempts to contact me during those tumultuous months, voicemails that began with apologies and grew increasingly desperate as her situation worsened. Text messages that ranged from, "I hope you are well," to "Please, I need to speak with someone who understands what truly transpired." I disregarded every single one, not entirely out of malice, though I admit spite played a minor role in my decision-making. I ignored them because I genuinely had nothing to say to her. What was I expected to do? Offer solace to the woman who dismantled our marriage based on deceit? Provide business counsel to someone who demonstrated such appalling judgment? Pretend that 3 years of my life hadn't been squandered on someone who valued her sister's manipulation over her husband's honesty. The final divorce documents were executed on a Tuesday morning in October, precisely 1 year after she had expelled me from the penthouse. I met her at the courthouse, a neutral venue with our lawyers present, ensuring a formal and impersonal process. She appeared diminished compared to my recollection, worn down by months of stress, financial strain, and a level of social isolation that accompanies public humiliation within a close-knit, gossip-prone business community. "Marcus," she said as we awaited the judge's final approval of the proceedings, "I want you to know that I understand now everything about what she did to us, about what I did to us. I realize I ruined the best thing in my life because my pride and my foolishness prevented me from seeing what was right in front of me." I looked at her, truly observed her for the first time in months, and felt utterly devoid of emotion. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering affection. She was simply a stranger who happened to share an unpleasant history with me. "I know you do," I replied softly, "but understanding your mistakes doesn't erase the damage. It doesn't return the 3 years I spent married to someone who—" I let the sentence trail off as she resumed, "I wish I could take it all back." "But you can't," I interrupted gently. "And that's the crucial point, Clara. Some errors are irreversible. Some trust, once shattered, cannot be mended. Some relationships, once destroyed, cannot be rebuilt." The judge called our case, and we proceeded through the final legal steps to dissolve what had once been the most significant relationship in both our lives. Signatures, official seals, formal declarations that Marcus and Clara Hale were no longer married, no longer bound by law, free to embark on separate paths. As I exited the courthouse, I experienced a feeling I hadn't known in over a year. Genuine happiness, not the bitter satisfaction of watching adversaries self-destruct, not the grim pleasure of being vindicated on every count, but true, unadulterated happiness about the future. I had a thriving business, friends who genuinely valued me for who I am rather than what I could offer, and for the first time in my adult existence, a future that was entirely my own. 6 months later, I can honestly state that being forced out of that penthouse was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I relished the pain, the humiliation, or the protracted legal battles, but because it compelled me to discover a resilience, intelligence, and capability within myself that I had previously underestimated. Clara's world crumbled because its foundation rested on the resources and lives of others. My new world is solid because I constructed it myself, one honest client relationship and one successful project at a time. And when I signed those final divorce papers, I didn't just end my marriage to Clara Whitmore. I commenced my life as Marcus Hale, and I can assure you it's infinitely better than anything I left behind.